We're gonna find some cube roots of some numbers, and if the little index number right there is a little 3, it's a cube root, and that means it takes 3 of a kind to take one out, or what number times itself again gets me back to 125. So here's a couple of examples before we dive into the specific example. The cube root of 1. Well, the number 1 is 1 times 1 times 1. So the cube root of 1 is 1. The cube root of 8. Well, 8 is 2 times 2 times 2. So the cube root of 8 is 2. 3 times 3 times 3 is 27. So the cube root of 27 is 3. 64 is 4 times 4 times 4, so that's why the cube root of 64 is 4. And 125 is 5 times 5 times 5, so that's why the cube root of 125 equals 5. Okay, so if it's a cube root, you're saying what number times itself again gets me back to the number underneath the square root. Just a little bit of vocabulary, the number under the root is called the radicand. Okay, so the only difference on this particular one is there's a negative sitting out front. So if there's a negative sitting out front, that negative is a -1 multiplied by the answer to the cube root of 125. And then that 125, 5 times 5 times 5 is 125. So the cube root of 125 is 5. That -1 sitting on the outside multiplied by 5, so my final answer is -5. Okay, so here's another example, but this time we have a negative underneath the root. Does anybody have any thoughts about, you see a negative under a root, what you might think about? When we've been doing square roots, what happens when you take a square root on a calculator and you get a negative? Yeah, you get an error message. That is not the case for odd roots. Odd roots do have answers. So the reason that that ends up being is -1 times -1 times -1 is -1. See how that's 3 of a kind? There are 3 identical numbers. So the answer is -1. The number -8 is -2 times -2 times -2. And so I have 3 identical numbers multiplied together, so the cube root of -8 is -2. You can continue on, I just listed a handful more. Cube root of -27 is -3 times -3 times -3, which is why it's -3. Okay, so big picture, even roots of negative numbers don't have real solutions. But odd roots of negative numbers do have real solutions. In this particular one here, I have that negative out front. Now don't accidentally think negative is positive. This is just a -1 multiplied by the answer to the cube root of -8. And then this one is saying what number times itself is -8. And we know that -2 times -2 times -2 is -8. So the cube root of -8 is -2 with this -1 times out front, and -1 times -2 is 2.